Greetings and a warm welcome to the Australia-China Media Watch podcast. This is episode 19, and in this episode we'll be looking at news articles from the 21st of March, Monday, running through to Sunday, the 27th of March, 2022. During the course of the week, there were 16 articles in the Global Times relating to Australia. And in contrast, and pretty noteworthy, for the first time in a number of months, there were more news articles from Sky News Australia about China compared to the number of articles from the Global Times about Australia. There were 23 articles from Sky News Australia for the duration in question. Let's begin by taking a closer look at the Global Times. The first article in question is entitled Biden's Criticism of India's Neutrality on Russia Exposes US Hypocrisy. Written by the Global Times, March 22nd, 11:19 p.m. It's found in the Opinion/Observer section and is accompanied by an illustration by Liu Rui about the US-India relationship. And on one side of things, it looks like you have American interests pondering about the role of India as a mere chess piece in the zero-sum game of global politics. Moving along to the opening paragraph, India's refusal to follow the US lead in condemning and sanctioning Russia over the Ukraine crisis has increasingly irritated Washington. After White House officials issued warnings to New Delhi on multiple occasions, US President Joe Biden singled out India for its shaky response to Russia's military operation against Ukraine, while addressing a meeting of US business leaders in Washington Monday. In the second paragraph, Biden lauded the US-led alliance, including NATO, the European Union, and key allies in the Pacific, especially Japan and Australia, for its united front against Russian President Vladimir Putin, but accused India of being an exception amongst Washington's allies and partners. Australia is mentioned twice in this article. First in the one that was just read, and Australia appears again in this paragraph. And this paragraph reads, disappointments and frustrations were also revealed in Biden's Monday speech. The US has made great efforts to court India in the past, but India has refused to serve as a hatchetman in the offensive against Russia. After all, the US-India relationship is based on expediency, said Lee. Unlike wavering US lackeys like Australia, India hopes to maintain a certain strategic autonomy. And just to provide a little bit of clarity, the quote provided comes in from Li Haidong, professor from the Institute of International Relations of China Foreign Affairs University. The paragraph continues to state, a big problem with American diplomacy is its disrespect to other countries and its arrogance in handling relations with other global powers. The concluding paragraph of this article reads, out of strategic selfishness, Washington has been fanning the flames of the Ukraine crisis and seeking profits. But most countries are not willing to be kidnapped by the US. They know the merits of the issue and where their interests are, and they determine their stance based on these. The true face of Washington has been made clear. It forces allies and partners to take sides regardless of the concerns or interests, which will make those countries become more cautious in developing relations with the US in the future. The so-called anti-Russia United Democratic Front cannot be established. Based on this initial impression of the article, the manner of which it is constructing Australia, I would make the argument is one of negativity as well as repulsiveness. Clearly seen from the labeling over here. Unlike unwavering US lackeys like Australia, India hopes to maintain a certain strategic autonomy, a clear case of othering happening, and in the other instance of Australia being mentioned, let's have a closer look at it again. Biden lauded the US-led alliance, including NATO, the European Union, and key allies in the Pacific, especially Japan and Australia, for its quote-unquote united front against Russian President Vladimir Putin. So based on this initial impression, I think it's pretty fair to say that Australia is represented in a negative manner, as well as containing ingredients of being repulsive, sitting on the other side of the fence. We move along to the next article. Published on the 22nd of March, 11:03 p.m. and found in the Opinion/Asian Review section of the Global Times. This headline reads, US prides itself on international allies, but may find itself lacking, by Jerry Gray. The article is accompanied with an illustration by Chen Xia. Based on this initial impression, it looks like the US is taking on the role of the Pied Piper, with a number of individuals seemingly happily following along to the tune of the Pied Piper as they get closer and closer to the edge of a cliff, while their eyes are wide shut. And based on what looks like a cartoonish representation of speed, it looks like there is a third group of individuals who are simply bystanders looking on and seemingly appearing somewhat confused. The opening paragraph of this article reads, CNN on Friday optimistically reported even some on Biden's own national security team were surprised at how quickly some US allies in Asia were willing to slap sanctions on Russia following its invasion. Truthfully, Biden's national security team would not have been at all surprised at the speed with which Japan, South Korea, and Australia, which it refers to as an Asian ally, followed the path of US sanctions. The three countries are, to all intents and purposes, locked into the same foreign policy path as the US. They would have been advised and probably not consulted on what action they needed to take. But the news, parroted by almost every US media outlet, is not as optimistic as it appears. Australia is mentioned once, twice, and a third time in the article, and let's take a closer look at mentions of Australia. So the first mention of Australia was in the article that I just read out. Australia appears once again in this paragraph, and it reads, American expectations of support are not uncommon. The UK and Australia will go along almost 100% of the time as they share similar foreign policy goals. The US also has good relations with New Zealand and Canada and can call upon these countries for help when the US needs them. However, when the US makes a mess far from home, as it did in Afghanistan last year, it appeals to China not with friendly requests for help, but with posturing and chest-thumping threats. Australia is mentioned again in this final paragraph in the article, which provides a bit of background into the author. Author being a British-Australian freelance writer who has studied cross-cultural change management in China and has lived in the country. Based on this initial impression, this looks like yet another negative construction or representation of Australia, and it can be seen somewhat in this line over here. American expectations of support are not uncommon. The UK and Australia will go along almost 100% of the time as they share similar foreign policy goals. But to provide a little bit more context into this, let's have a look at the paragraph that came before. What they fail to point out is that other major players in the region, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Vietnam, and in fact most Asian countries except Japan, South Korea, and Singapore haven't supported US sanctions. As an overall vibe of the article, I think that can be more clearly sensed by reading this concluding paragraph. And it states, after all, being America's friend may initially seem to be a pathway to better things, but can indeed, on close examination, be fatal. Calling Australia's decision to make the US a friend a potentially fatal error. Based on that impression, I think this would clearly be a negative construction of Australia, and beyond that, it really reinforces the idea that the Global Times has been painting Australia as one of the so-called mindless vanguards of the American anti-China narrative. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 22nd of March as well, and titled No Place for European-Style Conflict in the Indo-Pacific. It appears in the Opinion/Asian Review section of the Global Times, written by Lan Jianxue, and it's accompanied by an illustration entitled India-Australia FTA Talks Shouldn't Be Led by Anti-China Paranoia. So the illustration is pretty interesting. On one hand, it has what looks like an elephant symbolizing India, and on the right you have the kangaroo representing Australia. And as much as they're trying to find the middle path in moving forwards, it's not just a round hole square peg situation. This looks like potentially extremely damaging outcome. So the opening paragraph of this article reads, and in this instance, this article is directed towards Australia, with Australia the primary subject of the content. So Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison on Monday expressed his understanding of India's position on the crisis in Ukraine. Some Indian media outlets cited India's Foreign Minister Harsh Vardhan Shringala as saying. This line came after Morrison and his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi, apologies for that, concluded a virtual summit on the same day. India's neutral stance towards the Ukraine crisis has triggered dissatisfaction from Washington and its allies. Washington tried to mobilize allies like Tokyo to try to persuade New Delhi, but did so unsuccessfully. This time, it was Morrison's turn. As Morrison has long been an agent of the US, his expression of understanding indicates the allies in the US orbit have given up lobbying India over the Ukraine crisis. They do not want to see India's stance on this issue affect the cooperation in containing China. Let's take a closer look at mentions of Australia in the article, and it appears 1, 2, a third as well as a fourth time. And let's go through the mentions, starting with this paragraph over here. Furthermore, Morrison's notion conveys a sinister geopolitical intention. The US and its allies, like Australia, still want to contain China, but the Ukraine crisis has distracted their attention. Morrison hopes that the US will not reduce its investment in the Asia-Pacific region because of the crisis. Australia is mentioned once again in this paragraph, and it reads, India still sees China as its main threat and wants to contain China with the hope of the US, Japan, and Australia. Even though the Ukraine crisis won't severely affect the Quad, it will influence the scope and depth of the bloc's cooperation. Actually, it has tested how much India would like to cooperate with the US over issues of the latter's core concerns. If and when necessary, India would insist on its own principles. India's participation in the Quad is to safeguard its own national interests. If the bloc or the US wants India to do something that might jeopardize its national interests, India will surely resist. No further mentions of Australia is found in this article, and let's wrap it up by taking a look at the concluding paragraph. In addition, unlike Europe, countries in the Indo-Pacific appear to be interdependent. China's ties with its neighbors are strong in terms of politics, economy, and security. Regional countries have gradually grown accustomed to adopting a strategy that seeks development through regional cooperation. The geopolitical confrontation the US has created in Europe does not have a place in the Indo-Pacific. I think a central theme running through this article is the idea of an Indo-Pacific version of NATO, and based on what this article is trying to highlight is that the US and its allies like Australia still wants to contain China, but the Ukraine crisis has distracted their attention. Based on this initial impression, I think it's somewhat clear Australia is being constructed in a negative as well as a repulsive manner, with the central idea of the Indo-Pacific version of NATO, the warning bells that this article is trying to bring about. And with that, we'll move along to the next piece. This article is entitled GT Voice. Australia undermines CPTPP in desperate pursuit of talks with China. Published March 22nd, 2022 at 8:31 p.m. The opening paragraph of the article reads, during an industry event, Australian Trade Minister Dan Tehan claimed that China's chances of joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, could be hurt if it is unable to engage with Australia on a ministerial level, the South China Morning Post reported on Tuesday. The article is accompanied with an illustration by Tang Fei with a kangaroo hurling or throwing a anti-China boomerang that has ended up hitting the kangaroo's back of the head. I suppose in some ways the illustration is trying to represent self-sabotage when it comes to Australia's relationship with China, with its current slate of saber rattling represented by this anti-China boomerang. Interesting. Australia is mentioned a number of times in this article. All up, it looks like closer to the 20s, just to be sure. 21 mentions of Australia from start to finish. So let's take a closer look at the next paragraph. It's not uncommon to see Australian trade officials complain that China doesn't give them a chance to talk. In fact, they have been trying numerous tactics, including making wild accusations against China and using multilateral platforms to pressure China in hope for trade talks with China. However, what they cannot see is that it is Canberra's extreme and hostile words and deeds towards China that has disrupted bilateral engagement. Ever since China formally applied to join the CPTPP in September, it is not the first time for the Australian Trade Minister to link China's application to the trade disputes between the two countries. The bottom line is that if Canberra thinks it can use its CPTPP membership as a bargaining chip to pressure China into making concessions, it will be in for a big disappointment. The downward spiral of China-Australia economic and trade relations is rooted in Australia's extreme hostility to China on multiple fronts that has pushed bilateral ties to a multi-decade low. If anything, current tensions are inextricably linked to Australia's intention of using reckless provocations and malicious attacks against China to show its twisted loyalty and commitment to Washington. That I must admit is a first, and inextricably linked to Australia's intention of using reckless provocations and malicious attacks against China. And why is it doing so? According to the article, this is to illustrate, to demonstrate, to represent its twisted loyalty and commitment to Washington. Moving along to the next paragraph, such ridiculous provocations have recently reached its climax in the context of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison recently threatened to impose sanctions against China over the Ukraine situation, pathetically parroting similar threats made by US officials against China. Evidently, such threats made by US officials, or anyone for that matter, have not and will not work on China. The concluding paragraph of this article reads, in this sense, Australia's attempt to use its CPTPP membership to pressure China only reflects its profound short-sightedness and selfishness that could hurt all CPTPP members and the bloc's future development. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that Australia is represented and constructed in a negative manner, with a highlight in the paragraph which I had stressed earlier, right here, making use of these provocations and malicious attacks against China to show its twisted loyalty and commitment to Washington. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. And based on the article so far, it looks like a pretty negative start for the week. Biden's criticism of India's neutrality on Russia exposes US hypocrisy. That was a negative construction of Australia. So was the next one. So was the next one. And so is this one. Let's see if there is any good news of Australia in the Global Times this week at all. We'll move along to the next article, and potentially this could be one of a neutral construction. So appearing in the sports section of the Global Times, this headline reads, Pakistan stun West Indies to end losing streak at Women's Cricket World Cup. The opening paragraph reads, Pakistan ended an 18-month losing streak at Women's Cricket World Cups with an 8-wicket win over the West Indies in Hamilton on Monday, blowing open the race for the semi-finals. Australia is mentioned once in the article in what I think is a neutral representation. It was their first win at the World Cup since the 2009 tournament in Australia, where they also beat the West Indies. There are no further mentions of Australia in the article, and I think it will be fair to label this one as neutral. And with that, we'll move along to the next piece. This was published on the 22nd of March as well, originally by the AFP, and it comes with the headline 1.5 degrees Celsius goal on life support. This was found in the Eye on the World section of the Global Times, with the subheader reading, Guterres says world sleepwalking to climate catastrophe. The article is accompanied by an image of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva on February 28, 2022. The opening paragraph of this article reads, UN Chief Antonio Guterres said Monday the world is sleepwalking to climate catastrophe, with major economies allowing carbon pollution to increase when drastic cuts are needed. The planet-saving goal of capping global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius is already on life support, he told a sustainability conference in London. let's take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it appears once in this paragraph, and it reads, breaking the usual practice of not singling out countries, Guterres called out Australia and a handful of holdouts for failing to lay out meaningful near-term plans to slash emissions. And for a little bit more context, let's take a closer look at the paragraph from before. And it says, a bombshell report in 2021 from the Intergovernmental International Energy Agency concluded that a 1.5 degree world was incompatible with any new oil or gas developments or new coal-fired power plants. And to link that together, breaking the usual practice of not singling out countries, Australia was mentioned for failing to lay out meaningful near-term plans to slash emissions. Is this an article used as an example of othering? I think that pretty much is clear. And based on that single reference to Australia, I'm not sure if there's any way for us to claim that this is a positive construction. So yet again, a negative construction of Australia in the Global Times for the week. Not looking good so far. It's been 6 articles looked at, 5 articles being pretty clearly negative, and 1 which was neutral. We'll move along to the next article, and this one is directed towards Australia, and it comes with the following headline: Australia sets up Space Command against China, a political show risks arms race. Written by Liu Xuanzun, defense reporter at the Global Times, as well as Guo Yuandan, published March 23rd at 8:44 p.m. The article is accompanied with an image of Australian Defence Minister, apologies for that, my mistake, Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton. The opening paragraph of the article reads, following the lead of the US's Space Force and claiming to counter China and Russia, Australia announced the establishment of its Space Command in a move analysts said is a political show that reaffirms Australia's subordinate role to the US in an attempt to contain China militarily, despite the fact that Australia lacks the ability to do so. It has also exposed the fact that the West, led by the US, is the real pusher of militarization in outer space, they said. Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton said in a speech to the Australian Air Force on Tuesday that space will undoubtedly become a domain that takes on greater military significance in this century, the AFP reported on the day. Space is becoming more congested and is already contested, particularly as the boundaries between competition and conflict become increasingly blurred through grey zone activities. The minister said, noting that the Australian Space Command is a clear counter to China's and Russia's extraterrestrial military ambitions. So Australia's mentioned what looks like close to 22 mentions of Australia in total. Let's keep reading through. And let's have a look at this paragraph. It says, as Dutton said, Australia does not have the technological capabilities to build a real space force like the US, Chinese analysts said. Australia is not capable of entering space because it has no proper carrier, rocket, or space plane. Wei Dongxu, a Beijing-based military expert, told the Global Times on Wednesday. But Australia can allow the US to deploy satellite monitoring systems on its territory to monitor and gather intelligence, and the US can share the intelligence through the AUKUS framework, Wei warned, noting that Australia could also develop satellites together with the US. The Australian and US militarization of space targeting other countries could lead to a space arms race, and it could also negatively influence other countries' peaceful use of space. Australia is mentioned again drawing a link and reinforcing the narrative about AUKUS. Australia is getting its first nuclear-powered submarines through AUKUS and building a new base to host not only Australian submarines but also those from the US and UK, and it has announced plans to expand its military by 30%. In the concluding paragraph, I think it's pretty clear how Australia is being represented over here. The closing paragraph reads, "It is unwise for Australia to become a pawn for the US to contain China, risking lifting a rock only to drop it on its own feet," analysts have said. An interesting expression which I'll need to notate and keep into the archive. Unwise for Australia to become a pawn for the US to contain China, risking lifting a rock only to drop it on its own feet. Beyond a negative construction, I think it's pretty clear that this is too a repulsive construction of China, of Australia rather, a foil for China's own positive self-identity. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 23rd of March is this article with the headline, "Tropical Fish Pushing Further South." The subheader reads, "Migration due to climate change could cripple ecosystems." The article is accompanied with a photo taken on July 11th showing divers watching a whale shark near Ningaroo Reef in Western Australia. Now, this article was originally published by Xinhua, and the opening paragraph reads, "A joint research project between Australia's University of Technology Sydney and the University of Adelaide has discovered that the country's tropical fish have been migrating south as sea temperatures rise." The study, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society Biological Journal on Wednesday, built upon 20 years of data monitoring on the abundance of fish populations amongst and along Australia's east coast. Australia is mentioned a number of times in the article, 1, 2, 3, as was 4, and this is the final mention and appears in this paragraph. He noted that these behavioral adaptations were limited, and if waters continue to warm, the fish would be eventually left with nowhere to go, as they can't migrate any further than Australia's easternmost point of land. After Tasmania, there's nothing. They have a big open ocean with no habitat to settle in. Based on this initial impression of the article, I think this would make a negative construction of Australia. From the 8 articles I've looked at so far, the second article that seems to be constructing Australia in a neutral manner, and the remaining 6 negative. We'll move along to the next piece. This was published on the 24th of March, originally by Reuters, and it was found in the company section, and the headline reads, "Yacht builder Ferretti braves choppy waters with IPO valuing it at $1.2 billion. The article is accompanied with a photograph of yachts competing during the Rolex Sydney Hobart Yacht Race in Sydney, Australia on December 26th, 2021. The opening paragraph reads, "Italian luxury yacht builder Ferretti Group launched a Hong Kong IPO that values the company at up to $1.2 billion. A term sheet seen by Reuters showed going ahead despite volatility in global equity markets." Apologies. Australia is mentioned twice in the article, and they both appear in the captions which I have just read out. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say Australia is represented in a neutral manner. I think that's a pretty safe label for now. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 24th of March as well. This is originally by the AFP, found in the Asia Pacific section of the Global Times, and it has the following headlines. Australia accepts a New Zealand offer to take 450 refugees. It's accompanied with an image of Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison presenting his national statement at the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow on November the 1st. The opening paragraph reads, Australia accepted on Thursday a long-standing New Zealand offer to take hundreds of refugees detained for years in remote camps under Canberra's Pacific Solution immigration policy. The deal, which was originally tabled in 2013, will involve New Zealand welcoming 150 refugees annually for 3 years after they have been screened by the UN Refugee Agency. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it appears a number of times, appearing here in reference to Australia's Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews. Appears again. Wellington first made the offer at a time when Australia was looking to deter record numbers of asylum seekers arriving by boat. Australia is mentioned twice in this paragraph. Canberra sent them to detention camps, vowing no asylum seeker who arrived by boat would ever be allowed to permanently settle in Australia. At the time, it rejected Wellington's offer over fears that refugees would eventually wind up in Australia. The concluding paragraph reads, the UNHCR welcomed the deal, saying prolonged uncertainty had taken an enormous toll on refugees caught up in Australia's offshore processing system. This one does require a closer read, something I'll definitely need to revisit during analysis. From this initial impression, where would this sit in terms of the manner of construction? There's the bit of it highlighting how Australia has been seeking to deter asylum seekers. Then the fact that this was originally by the AFP, the decision by the editor to include this article into the Global Times in the World/Asia Pacific section would suggest to me that there is more than meets the eye, that I'm just going to read through this just to be doubly sure. Australia remains firm. Illegal maritime arrivals will not settle here permanently. So it's attempting to paint Australia in a very specific way, reinforcing its stance that people arriving by boat were not welcome. Would this be equivalent to painting Australia as repulsive? Perhaps. I think for now I'll categorize this article as between somewhat negative, because as I'm reading through the headline again, it almost reads like there's a subtext of Australia's passing on the responsibility to New Zealand. So I'm not sure if I can see anything positive from this article, which means I'm pretty happy with the categorization of it sitting between neutral and somewhat negative. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. And this was published on the 24th of March as well. A photo story with the headline, Singapore to lift virus travel restrictions, with the subheader, other measures also eased, including outdoor masking requirements, published March 24th at 6:43 p.m. Entitled, Does Australia's Defence Space Command Want to Confront China? This article is found in the Observer section, published March 23rd at 11:57 p.m. This piece is directed towards Australia, and it's accompanied by an illustration by Liu Rui, with what looks like the symbolism of American power directing the sights of the Australian kangaroo. The opening paragraph reads, Australia's Defence Space Command, established in January 2022, officially began operating on Tuesday. Kath Roberts, head of the command, claimed that she was most scared of the activities by China and Russia. She then made an example of how a Chinese satellite could easily take out Australia's national broadband network. Apparently, Canberra has regarded its Defence Space Command as a counterweight to the military ambitions in space of Beijing and Moscow, particularly the former. Australia is mentioned a number of times in the article, and it looks like 26. No, that would be incorrect. I'll subtract 1, 2, 3. 24 mentions of Australia is in this article, so let's continue unpacking it. In the second paragraph, Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton also said on Tuesday that space is a domain which must be used to deter aggression rather than become a new realm for conflict. In his words, Australia's goal in space will be to invest in new military space capabilities to counter threats. But judging from Australia's official statements, it seems that Australia's ambitions to have more military presence in space aim at confrontation rather than deterrence or countermeasures. Australia has long been involved in space activities. In 1967, the country successfully launched its first satellite, WRESAT, making Australia the 7th country in the world to launch a satellite and the 3rd to launch a satellite into orbit from its own territory, right after the US and the Soviet Union. For a long time, developing its space activities instead of just being a partner of other countries was not on top of Canberra's agenda. It was until 2018 that the Australian Space Agency, an organisation focusing mainly on the development of the domestic civil space sector, was eventually established. There's nothing wrong that Australia intends to vigorously develop its activities in space, as long as they're not hostile or bellicose toward anyone. It is feared that more military presence in space will only accelerate the arms race there and undermine peace. But look at where we are. A Space Command has already started operating in Australia. This is an example of Australia's growing military ambitions in recent years. It wants to have more influence in the region and the world, even in space. Throughout Australia's history in space, the US's role cannot be ignored. Canberra and Washington have been operating on their space programs. According to Chinese military expert Song Zhongping, Australia has no real space capabilities. In his opinion, Canberra is highly dependent on Washington in many aspects that are related to space activities. The command is more likely an addition to the US Space Force launched in 2019. It will most likely be just an office of the USSF in Australia or the Australian branch of the USSF, noted Song. From AUKUS to the Defence Space Command, Australia's posture to follow the US to suppress China is becoming clearer and clearer, but it's also falling deeper and deeper into a strategic quagmire by blindly following Washington. It has thus decided to become increasingly militaristic to counter the China threat, a concept the US has been hyping for years. This will only end up Canberra hurting itself and its interests. In Song's opinion, Australia has always believed it can become a global power by following a superpower like the US. However, it still hasn't come to realize that the power of the US is already on the decline. So, without a more independent and clearer strategy, Australia will find it more difficult to realize its dreams. No further mentions of Australia is found in this article, although Peter Dutton is mentioned in the concluding paragraph. So the start of the Defence Space Command's operations has offered Canberra yet another chance to reflect on itself. Should it continue being cannon fodder in the US strategic layout to contain China, Dutton hopes to prevent space from becoming a new realm for conflict. He should also remember that space shouldn't become a new battlefield against China or any other force for that matter. Based on this first impression, I think it's pretty clear that an act of othering is certainly in place, and this is a negative construction of Australia. With that, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 25th of March, originally by the AFP, found in the sports section, comes the following headline: Unrepentant Fallout targets Rugby World Cup return with Tonga. With the subheader, definitely interested. It comes with a photograph with the following captions: Shining Arcs Tokyo Bay Uruyasu's Australian player Israel Folau fights for the ball in the Japan Rugby League 1 match against Toyota Verblitz on March 20th, 2022. The opening paragraph of the article reads, controversial Israel Folau is definitely interested in playing for Tonga in next year's Rugby World Cup and has no regrets over the homophobic comments that ended his Wallabies career. Australia is mentioned a number of times in the article, from this reference here to when the devoutly Christian fullback was sacked by Rugby Australia in 2019 for saying that hell awaits gay people and others he considers sinners in a post on social media. Australia is mentioned again in this paragraph, and referring to him being booted out for high-level breach of Rugby Australia's code of conduct. Mentioned a few more times in reference to his nationality, and once again in this paragraph when he was previously embroiled in a similar row, going on to cause further offence when he suggested that bushfires and drought ravaging Australia were God's judgment for the legalization of same-sex marriage and abortion. Another reference over here to Rugby Australia. One more over here with regards to Rugby Australia's reportedly having paid the sports person $4 million Australian dollars, and the player claiming he had been vindicated. Any further references to Australia? It looks like that's pretty much it. And let's see, I'll do a quick count. 1, 2, 3, 4. So 7 mentions of Australia within the article. And based on this initial impression, I would say that Australia as the country, as the nation, falls in the range of somewhat neutral, although this might be a tricky one, as it also paints a picture of Australia as a place where such an unfair dismissal could take place. So definitely need to revisit this during the analysis stage, but at this point it's probably gonna sit between somewhat negative to neutral. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. This one was published on the 27th of March by Xu Keyue, Global Times reporter following Australia and Japan issues. It's found in the China/diplomacy section, and this article is targeted directly towards Australia. The headline reads, Morrison declines to meet new Chinese envoy, continues anti-China rhetoric to boost re-election bid. The article is accompanied with a file picture of the Australian PM. And the opening paragraph reads, although the new Chinese ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, has been generating obvious goodwill towards Australia since he took office in January, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison still ruled out a meeting with the ambassador, giving the excuse that Beijing's diplomatic freeze has yet to thaw. China has demonstrated a magnanimous and responsible image as a great power, with its new ambassador holding out an olive branch to Australia. which is beneficial to breaking the ice between the two countries, while in contrast, Morrison again shut the door to communication and is taking a gamble by using this meeting request from Xiao as another opportunity to show his anti-China stance. I'm hoping that the behind-the-scenes forces from the US will help him in the upcoming election as they did the last time, Chinese analysts pointed out. Australia's mentioned multiple times throughout the article. It looks like it's in the 20s. Do some quick math over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 17 mentions of Australia within the article, and let's do a quick scan through each one of these mentions. So according to Australian media reports, Morrison told reporters on Saturday it would be inappropriate for him to meet while the diplomatic freeze continues. So long as China continues to refuse to have a dialogue with Australian ministers and the PM, I think that's an entirely proportional response. Morrison claiming that the meeting with Xiao will be a demonstration of weakness. Morrison's refusal to meet with Xiao shows great disrespect not only to Ambassador Xiao himself, but also to China, which exposes his increasing hostility towards China. And a name that keeps popping up in the Global Times, Chen Hong, president of the Chinese Association of Australian Studies and the director of the Australian Studies Centre at East China Normal University, told the Global Times on Sunday. Citing the more friendly and conciliatory tone struck by the new Chinese ambassador since he took office in January, Chen said Xiao is committed himself to improving China-Australia ties, noting it is normal, customary, and reasonable for a new ambassador to meet the head of the host country. Morrison's refusal again reflects that Canberra is responsible for the sluggish China-Australia relations, Chen said. Kind of midway point the article, and it's becoming somewhat clear that this is an example of othering taking place, and it looks like a pretty negative construction of Australia up to this point. Another mention of Australia is found in this paragraph. According to Public Opinion Australia, Morrison was widely expected to step down before the upcoming election, given his plunging popularity and poor economic recovery and diplomatic performance. So targeting the Australian PM in this instance. So Morrison is taking a tough rhetorical line to show his allies to some forces in the US, gambling they'll help him in the election as they did the last time. Australia's mentioned again here. Western media reports said the deal has triggered geopolitical anxieties for Australia and the US. Mentioned here again, Australia has long considered Pacific Islands nations as its backyard, but the fact is that as a sovereign and independent state, Solomon Island has the right to strengthen mutually beneficial cooperation with China and other countries. To develop relations with China is the common aspiration of the island nation, not China's unilateral aspiration, Yu said, noting that the island nation believes this can counter the hegemony of Australia. The concluding paragraph reads, the island nation needs to improve its economy, but what they received from Australia was only economic exploitation and plunder, while developing mutually beneficial cooperation with China is conducive to its sustainable economic development, Yu said. Based on this initial impression of the article, I think it's fair to say that it is yet another negative construction of Australia, and yet another reminder of sluggish and deteriorating China-Australia relations. With that said, we'll move along to the next article, and this is also published on the 27th of March. This is found in the China/military section of Global Times. with the following headline. US practices new war concepts with 100 plus drills near China, according to a think tank report. Written by Liu Xuanzun, defense reporter at the Global Times, covering weapons and military development. The article is accompanied with a photograph of a shipborne helicopter attached to a frigate flotilla, with the Navy under the PLA Southern Theater Command lands on the flight deck of a guided missile frigate Wuzhou under the guidance of a sailor. Photo provided by the Chinese military. The opening paragraph of the article reads, the US held more than 100 large-scale military exercises near China last year, practicing and validating several new war concepts targeting the country, a Beijing-based think tank revealed on Sunday, shortly before the US and the Philippines are reportedly about to launch the largest ever joint drills on Monday. Australia is mentioned once in the article, and it appears here in the following paragraph. And just to build up the context a little bit more, I'm going to read the paragraph before as well. Amongst the 95 drills, 14 consisted solely of arms of the US military, including the Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Army, and Coast Guard. They featured training courses including anti-ship, anti-submarine, anti-sea mine, amphibious, cyberspace, and maritime situational awareness missions. The other 81 were joint exercises with other countries, including those along the coastlines of the South China Sea, as well as those from outside the region, including Japan, the UK, Australia, India, France, and Canada. The CSCPI report said, noting that both the frequency and scale of the drills reached new highs. No further mentions of Australia is found in this article, and just to wrap things up a little bit more cleanly, let's conclude the look at the article. So it does come with an infographic entitled US Military Activities in South China Sea since 2021. In 2021, the US military has deployed 4 carrier strike groups: the Theodore Roosevelt, the Ronald Reagan, the Carl Vinson, and the Nimitz, 2 amphibious ready groups, 11 nuclear-powered submarines. The US Air Force has dispatched a total of 22 bombers for 14 operations. In terms of further expanded close-in reconnaissance, 12,000 reconnaissance sorties, including over the South China Sea, US ocean surveillance ships and oceanographic survey ships conducting operations, 419 ship days at sea, and stirring up the Taiwan Strait situation. Since the Biden administration took office in 2021, the US warships transited the Taiwan Strait 12 times, 5 times to the north, 5 times north of south, and 7 times south to north. US reconnaissance aircraft also joined Taiwan Strait transit operations. Military exercises, 85 military drills throughout 2019, 95 military drills throughout 2021. So that's been an increase. From August 2nd to 27, 2021, the US held the first large-scale exercise 21, calling it the largest military exercise in 4 decades. Approximately 25,000 personnel participated. Joint actions with extra-regional countries were strengthened. 75 military exercises in the South China Sea and neighboring areas, with extra-regional countries nearly double the 2019 figure of 39. Exercise subjects that were highly targeted: Exercise Carrot, Exercise Evo, Exercise Annual X 21. And that concludes a look at the article and its accompanying infographic. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that Australia is constructed in a negative manner, being on the side of the team of the group of allies which are conducting these joint exercises in the containment of China. So, a negative representation. We'll move along to the final article of the week, running from Monday the 21st of March to Sunday the 27th of March 2022. And we have this following article, and its headline reads, Exhibition of Indigenous Art opens in National Gallery of Australia. Published originally by Xinhua and found in the Life/Culture section of the Global Times. The opening paragraph online reads, an exhibition bringing together works of Indigenous artists kicks off at the National Gallery of Australia on Saturday. Titled the 4th National Indigenous Art Triennial Ceremony, the new exhibition showcases 18 new bodies of work by 38 First Nations artists from across the country and will run until July 31st. We'll take a closer look at the mentions of Australia. Appears once, a second time, a third time, a fourth, and a fifth. So 5 mentions of Australia all up. And based on this initial impression as well as scan of the article, one might make the argument Australia is represented in a somewhat positive manner. An exhibition showcasing indigenous art, lending weight to the narrative that Australia is the place that contains the world's longest continuing civilization. So rather than just exposing the Chinese publics and readers of the Global Times to just the contemporary identity of modern day Australia, the fact that they're doing this does provide a certain amount of positive balance. So from my current perspective, a positive construction of Australia in this case. And this concludes our look at articles coming in from the Global Times. We'll now switch our attention over to Sky News Australia. The first article from Sky News Australia is entitled Passenger Plane Crashes in Remote China. So this was published March 22nd, 2022 at 6:49 a.m. The article contains a few lines, and the opening line reads, China Eastern Airways Boeing 747 has crashed in China's southern Guangxi Hills region. The article is accompanied with a video 1 minute and 59 seconds in duration, and the article is found in the World News section of Sky News Australia. Yeah, but before we do so, based on this initial impression, this would make a neutral representation of China, I would believe. We'll move along to the next article, and this was published also on the 22nd of March written by David Wu, digital reporter, 7:25 a.m. And the headline reads, No sign of life in China Eastern Airlines flight MU5735, a plane crash in Guangxi region that killed all 132 passengers on board. The subheader reads, fatalities have been confirmed after a Chinese Eastern Airlines plane crashed into the side of a mountain, exploding on impact and sparking a bushfire in the remote dense land. The opening paragraph or line of this article reads, all 132 passengers on board a Chinese Eastern Airlines flight are believed to be dead after the plane plunged into the side of a mountain in China. Horrifying CCTV footage reportedly captured the plane's final moments as it appeared to nosedive into dense forest over Guangxi province near Guangzhou on Monday afternoon. Villagers near the remote crash site recorded the aftermath of the incident, which showed a large section of bushland on fire. China is mentioned multiple times throughout the article, including from this tweet. Unreal footage of the China Eastern Airlines flight literally taking a 90-degree nosedive. Another mention over here, reported footage of the plane crash, and China is mentioned again in relation to, we are shocked to learn of the China Eastern MU 5735 accident, and one more over here in relation to a tweet, China Eastern Airlines, and further mentions of China in relation to China Eastern Airlines, and one paragraph over here which talks about the last fatal plane accident in China happened in 2010 when 44 of the 96 passengers were killed in the Henan Airlines aircraft that might be missing from the article that crashed in Yichun Airport due to low visibility. The airline has grounded all 737-800s until further noticed. Based on this initial impression, I would make the argument that this is representing China in a neutral manner. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 22nd of March as well. This article is accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 7 seconds in duration, and the headline reads, "No sign of survivors after passenger plane crashes in remote China." Yeah, no signs of survivors after China Eastern Airlines passenger plane crashed into the side of a mountain in China. All 132 passengers on board are believed to be dead after the plane plunged in China's southern Guangxi Hills region. No further mentions of China is found in the article, and just like the two articles before that, I believe that this is a neutral construction or representation of China. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. Entitled, "Possibly a Terror Attack, Aviation Expert Assess China Eastern Airlines Crash." This article is accompanied with a video 3 minutes and 52 seconds in duration, and it has the opening paragraph reading, Sky News aviation expert Byron Bailey says passengers aboard the crashed China Eastern Airlines flight would have been screaming all the way down as the plane plunged into the side of a mountain. Mr. Bailey said the Boeing 737-800 had perfect flight conditions, given the temperature and wind speeds. All 132 passengers on board are believed to be dead after the plane plunged into a forest over China's Guangxi province on Monday afternoon, local time. China is mentioned multiple times throughout the article, and just like the ones that have come in before, I think this is yet another neutral representation or construction of China. This headline reads, "A catastrophic event, no survivors in China plane crash." It's accompanied with a video 6 minutes and 24 seconds in duration, and its opening lines read, Avlaw Aviation Consulting Manager Director Ron Bosch says something catastrophic has happened concerning the circumstances of the plane crash in China. Terrorism's got to be one of the plausible explanations, I guess, he told Sky News Australia. We really need that data to be able to find out, determine what caused this horrific incident. Beyond that, design, manufacture, and pilot fatigue can all be ruled out, pointing to the clear conditions of the domestic flight and that a mayday call was not released. Based on this initial impression, I think I might categorize this entitled, "Crash of China Passenger Plane." Very puzzling. This article is accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 44 seconds in duration, and it's found in the World News section. The opening line reads, Flight Safety Foundation CEO Dr. Hassan Shahidi says the crash of a China Eastern Airlines plane, which plummeted from the sky abruptly, is very puzzling. Dr. Shahidi said the plane was flying at a cruise altitude at 29,000 feet when it began to descend. The article moves on to state it lost 21,000 feet in approximately 70 seconds from the time of descent to the crash was less than 2 minutes. And so this is indeed very puzzling, and it's really something that investigators will be looking into. Based on this impression, I think China is represented in a neutral manner, as the article is seeking to deliver a range of opinions with regards to the cause of the crash. So nothing political over here. This would be a neutral construction of China. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. This is entitled President Xi Jinping orders all-out search and rescue operation following horror South China plane crash. The subheader reads, the Chinese president has ordered the immediate launch of emergency response and all-out search and rescue efforts following the horror plane crash, which is believed to have killed all 132 passengers on board. This was written by Jack Mahoney, March 22nd, 2022, at 5:17 p.m. The opening lines read, rescue crews and investigations have begun to work on the crash site of flight MU5735, which plunged into the side of a mountain in the south side of China. All of the 132 people on board are believed to be dead. Chinese President Xi Jinping has ordered an all-out search and rescue operation, adding that he was shocked to learn about the incident. He ordered the immediate launch of an emergency response, all-out search and rescue efforts, and the proper settlement of the aftermath. The Civil Aviation Administration of China website reported. The article moves on to state Xi ordered swift action to be taken to identify the cause of the crash and to strengthen the safety overhaul of the civil aviation sector to ensure the absolute safety of the sector and people's lives. The concluding paragraphs of the article read, China Eastern Airlines confirmed there were casualties in the crash but did not provide further details. The company expresses its deep condolences, and company changed its website and social media profile photos to black and white to mourn the loss, while the airline grounded all of its Boeing 737-800 planes. Based on this initial impression, I am inclined to think that China is represented in a somewhat positive to positive manner. We move along to the next piece, and that's based on the fact that the highlighting sees swift action to identify the cause of the crash and to strengthen the safety overhaul of the sector. And with that, we move along to the next piece. Published on the 23rd of March is this next headline. Investigators attempting to confirm cause of deadly China plane crash. So there were a number of articles on the 22nd of March with a range of investigators as well as experts being queried on why they thought such a crash could happen, and this is a lead continuation of that. This is found in the World News section of Sky News Australia, and the opening line reads, investigators are trying to determine why a Boeing 737 passenger jet crashed in southern China, killing all 132 people on board. DFAT has confirmed no Australians were believed to be on board the plane. Emergency services are now in attendance, currently searching for the aircraft's black boxes to try and explain its very sudden descent. Based on this impression, I think China is represented in a neutral manner. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. published on the 23rd of March as well. This headline reads, Aviation expert does not believe China Eastern plane crash was caused by technical issue as rescue crews find no reports of survivors. The subheader reads, an Australian aviation expert does not believe the China Eastern plane suffered a technical event by the way it dived nose first from an altitude of 29,100 feet to 9,075 feet in just 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Written by Crystal Wu. It's accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 50 seconds in duration, and the captions which accompany it read, investigators are trying to determine the cause of the crash, killing all 132 people on board. The opening lines of this article reads, an Australian aviation expert does not believe the crash was caused by a technical issues. Strategic Aviation Solutions Chairman Neil Hansford said the sudden plunge from the sky suggested it was not a technical event. I don't believe it's the aircraft. I don't believe it's a technical event related to the aircraft, and that's been supported by colleagues all around the world, he told Sky News Australia's Peter Cretlin on Tuesday night. The aircraft flying down with the trajectory of a stone is not the way an aircraft would come down from the cruise at 20,000 feet. The article is accompanied by another video of 4 minutes and 45 seconds in length, entitled Chinese Airliner Crash Not Going to Be Independently Analyzed. The concluding paragraph of this article reads, Boeing is in contact with the US National Transportation Safety Board, and our technical experts are prepared to assist with the investigation led by the Civil Aviation Administration of China. Based on this initial impression, I was inclined to read this as a neutral construction. However, I think there's cause for further investigation with the contents in the video, with the Strategic Aviation Solution chairperson Neil Hansford saying crash.
Now let's turn to this.
Let's have a look and listen.
That film you're just showing now of the aircraft flying down with the trajectory of a stone is not the way an aircraft would come down from the cruise at 20-odd thousand feet when it was losing altitude.
Thereby suggesting that there's a lot more than meets the eye with regards to the crash. Something I'll have to reevaluate during the analysis stage. For now, I'm just going to leave it as a neutral representation. We move along to the next article. Published on the 23rd of March, this next headline reads, Chinese city of Shenyang thrown into lockdown after country records more than 4,000 coronavirus infections. Shenyang is the second Chinese city to be locked down this month as the nation pursues its contentious zero COVID policy. The article is accompanied with a video with the title Dictator Sees New World Order has reached Australia. A clearly negative construction from the onset via the title. The video has captions that read, Russia and China are a new anti-democratic axis of evil threatening our country, says Sky News host Andrew Bolt. Based on this initial impression, a case of othering taking place, I think that is a tick in a box. The opening paragraph of the article goes on to read, the city of Shenyang, which is home to more than 9 million residents, has been thrown into a strict lockdown as China battles its biggest COVID-19 outbreak in 2 years. Residents in Shenyang are not permitted to leave their homes without a 48-hour negative test results and are under what is being labeled close management after the lockdown was enforced on Monday night. China has mentioned multiple times throughout the article. And in a paragraph such as this one, China recorded its COVID-19 deaths, the first COVID-19 deaths in more than a year, on Saturday. China is mentioned again over here in this paragraph. Officials in China are urging elderly citizens to come forward for COVID-19 jab, pointing to Hong Kong. There's an accompanying video entitled Chinese Stock Markets Drop Amid Widespread Lockdown. This is a video 2 minutes and 20 seconds in duration. And further from that, another video towards the end of the article, China attempting to disband the Commonwealth, says Farage. The captions read, Brexit leader Nigel Farage says China sees the powerful English-speaking world as a threat. Based on this initial impression of the article, I think it's fair to say that China is not exactly represented in a positive light. The article itself is pretty direct in terms of reporting the news, but when it comes to the accompanying videos, which will be part of the user experience, they paint another picture from this one. China attempting to disband the Commonwealth, Chinese stock market drops amid widespread lockdown, and this one, dictator sees new world order has breached Australia. It'll be an interesting piece to analyze. On one hand, the textual information messaging leads one way, but the accompanying multimedia certainly adds in a lot more complex food for thought. With that in mind, we'll move along to the next article, entitled Black Box Retrieved from China Plane Wreckage. This next article is published on March the 24th, 2022 at 8:34 a.m. It's found in the World News section, and as the opening paragraph reads, rescuers have retrieved one of 2 black boxes from the wreckage of the China Eastern Airways flight that nosedived with 132 passengers on board. The black box is reportedly in such bad condition, officials can't distinguish if it is the flight data recorder or the cockpit voice recorder. The cause of the crash in China's south is still unknown. Aviation officials warn it will be difficult to determine the cause, considering the severity of the damage to the aircraft. Based on this initial impression, I think this is an article that's constructing China in a neutral manner. And with that, we'll move along to the next piece. Following up from the previous article, this article published on March the 24th at 8:55 a.m. is also about the crash, and it reads, the headline, Chinese officials send recovered black box in China Eastern flight crash to Beijing for investigation into cause of crash. The subheader reads, Chinese search officials have found 1 out of 2 black boxes, a cockpit voice recorder, as the search for information regarding the cause of the flight continues. Written by Crystal Wu. The article is accompanied by video 36 seconds in length, black box retrieved from China plane wreckage. And the opening line of this article reads, Chinese search teams have found the black box from the China Eastern Airlines flight that nosedived into a mountain, killing all 132 passengers and crew on board. The Civil Aviation Administration of China, the SKA, on Wednesday announced that they had found 1 out of 2 black boxes, a cockpit voice recorder, 3 days after the Boeing 737-800 crashed in the Guangxi region. The article goes on to state fire and rescue personnel and the kind of tools they made use of, the challenges they encountered. There are some references over here to content on Twitter, like this picture of the black box. And beyond that, China is mentioned a number of times. Six times in total, and the concluding paragraphs read, all 123 passengers and 9 crew were killed. Based on this initial impression, I think this article is simply reporting the news, so that would make a neutral construction. With that, we'll move along to the next piece. Published on March 24th, 2022, this next headline reads, China's ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, insists Beijing has no preference between Liberal or Labour ahead of federal election. The subheader reads, China's ambassador to Australia says Beijing has a policy of never interfering with the domestic affairs of another country. This was written by Joseph Whitson, March 24th at 4:20 p.m. The article is accompanied with a video 10 minutes and 8 seconds in length entitled Peace Between Australia and China Should Be Attempted with Eyes Wide Open, with Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce saying he wants peace in Australia-China relations, but it cannot be done with a frame of naivety. It comes as figures on both sides of politics have responded cautiously to an olive branch. The opening paragraph of this article reads, Beijing has indicated it will not be supporting either Labour or Liberal ahead of the federal election. China's new ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, told the Chinese embassy, Beijing has no interest in getting involved and it's willing to work with either party. We have a policy, it's a policy of principle, that we never interfere with the domestic affairs of any country, and the election of this country is the domestic affair of Australia, he said. The article then has another accompanying video of 51 seconds in duration, entitled New Chinese Ambassador to Australia Describes Role as a Noble Mission. I think it's useful to highlight this paragraph once again, that the ambassador is reinforcing China's assertion that the domestic affairs of another country is not their business, that there is no intention to interfere. The article continues to state, we have no intention, no interest to get involved, we have no choice of this party or that party, but whoever's going to be the ruling party after the election, we are looking forward to a much more positive relationship. Mr. Xiao continued by saying that China is ready to get the relationship with Australia back in the right direction. The article is accompanied by images of Scott Morrison, and the captions here read, Beijing has indicated it will not be supporting either Labour or Liberal, and that's contrasted with an image of Anthony Albanese speaking at the National Press Club. The article continues to state, we're ready to work with the new government to grasp this year, the 50th anniversary of our diplomatic relations, back to the right direction so that China and Australia can move forward to the benefit of our two countries and peoples. In 2020, the Chinese embassy published a list of 14 grievances it had with Australia, most notably Canberra's call for an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. Beijing then imposed a range of tariffs on Australian goods, including wine, barley, beef, and lobster in 2021. The article is accompanied with a further video entitled A New Chinese Ambassador Using a Different Language to Predecessor, a video that's 2 minutes and 15 seconds in duration.
Now to these comments by the new Chinese ambassador, just arrived this week, and a real shift in tone from his predecessor.
So Chinese ambassador offers olive branch, a shift in tone.
And I'm sure there are some in government who'll speculate, is he predicting a Labor victory. Is he trying to change the language ahead of that? Or they might say the Chinese can't be believed. I guess it might be a change from the Wolf Warrior stance, though. Really interesting. I know I think you've got Stuart.
It's interesting, a shift in the Wolf Warrior stance.
Robert coming on, the government minister, close confidant of Scott Morrison. So,
and a reference over to the Global Times, sending a goodwill message to reset.
We're really interested to hear his views on this, Kieran.
And that was a message that was sent on Australia's National Day. This is dating back to January 26th, 2022. The article has another video accompanying it, entitled "Australia Calls Out China for Politically Motivated Trade Practices." Australia has called out Chinese coercion in a blistering statement to the World Trade Organization. Based on this initial impression of the article, I think it's pretty clear that China is represented in a negative light, with some highlights being the reminder of the 14 grievances, and then the resultant range of tariffs, and the ambassador then trying to make this point that China is willing to work with Australia to meet each other halfway. That at the time of appointment, Mr. Xiao noted Australia and China were at a critical juncture, but wanted the relationship to get back on track. Overall, I think somewhat negative to a negative construction of China. Reason being, the text might sit somewhat in a neutral manner, but the accompanying videos like this one, 6 minutes and 13 seconds duration, Australia calling out China for politically motivated trade practices, suggests to me that there is more that meets the eye when it comes to this piece of content. Beyond that, the opening video towards the beginning, peace between Australia and China should be attempted with eyes wide open. So certainly an undertone of great suspicion. So somewhat negative, perhaps. Something worth revisiting during the analysis. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. This is titled "Standing Up to China Needs a Nuanced Approach," published March 24th, 2022 at 4:06 p.m. Deloitte's Access Economics lead partner Pradeep Philip says Australia's economic reliance on China is also a security question. Mr. Phillips said Australia's relationship with China has been growing for years, especially because China is Australia's largest export market. China has started exerting itself economically and in terms of geopolitics. These are some things we do absolutely need to stand up to China on, but we need a nuanced approach. Overall, the sense I get from this is that China is represented in a somewhat negative manner. What the experts trying to say is that despite the economic interdependence, there are some out-of-boundary markers that have to be set in this relationship. So for that reason, a somewhat negative construction of China in this case. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. It comes with the headline, "Joe Biden warns Vladimir Putin it will respond over chemical weapons use," and tells China it has more ties to the West. The US president believes Russia should be kicked out of the G20 and sent a stern warning to Vladimir Putin following emergency meetings with NATO world leaders over the Ukraine invasion. Found in the World News/Global Affairs section of Sky News Australia. This was written by David Wu and published March 25th at 7:30 a.m. The article is accompanied with a video entitled "Leaders Hold Emergency Summits in Brussels." It's 2 minutes and 24 seconds in duration. And the opening line of this article reads, "President Joe Biden has warned the United States will respond if Russia decided to use chemical weapons in its invasion on Ukraine." China is mentioned a number of times in the article, and it appears here President Biden believes NATO is as strong and united as ever following the announcements. He also sent a message to China following his warning it could suffer consequences if it supported the Kremlin's Ukraine war. I made no threat, but I made it clear to him, made sure he understood the consequences of helping Russia, Mr. Biden said of a recent telephone conversation with Chinese President Xi Jinping. China understands that its economic future is much more closely tied to the West than it is to Russia. Another mention of China appears in this line. China has been defiant, saying Russia is an important member of the G20. And the article is accompanied with the following set of comments. First up, by unpopular reality check. Go home, Sleepy Joe. Americans are tired of war. Haven't you got enough problems to solve on home soil? Happy-go-lucky. Well, what a perfect time to review the history of use of banned weapons. Bob, it's interesting watching a puppet kingdom of the USA get invaded by a large military nation and then watch as the USA does nothing. Old Crow, Joe speaking gibberish again. George, here having Russia in the G20 might give us some advice on what sanctions the rest of us can do to them, which would have the greatest impact. The Wuza, will Joe use the same red line Obama used in Syria? I'm sure Putin is cracking in his boots. Based on this initial impression of the article, it does look like there's an act of othering taking place, with President Joe Biden giving an ultimatum towards the Chinese that consequences would follow if they supported the Kremlin's Ukraine war. Also, another point that's being stressed over here, which is interesting, tying together China's economic fate with the West rather than Russia. With that, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 25th of March, this headline reads, Solomon Islands reaches new agreement with China. It's accompanied with a video 40 seconds in duration entitled Solomon Islands reaches new agreement with China as well. The article reads, in its opening paragraph, the Solomon Islands is in discussions with China to allow military forces to be stationed in the Pacific nation, according to a leaked document. The document says it will allow China to protect the safety of Chinese personnel in major projects in the Solomon Islands. Ships will be allowed to stop over the archipelago, which is 1,700 kilometers off the coast of Queensland. The Solomon Islands has been increasing its ties with China since severing diplomatic relations with Taiwan in 2019. Now, this will certainly be a huge cause for concern for Australia, and I'll be keen to see what kind of follow-up articles will emerge as a result of this news event. Based on this initial impression, one might make the argument that China is represented in a somewhat sinister light, so negative and repulsive. I believe that's a tick. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 25th of March as well, a little bit later on at 10:15 a.m. This next headline reads, China's military ties with Solomon Islands, simply unacceptable for defense of Australia, security expert warns. China's potential new military pact in the Pacific could create a threat to Australia's east coast, with a potential hostile military base less than 2,000 kilometers from Queensland, a security expert has warned. The article is accompanied with a video 40 seconds in duration entitled Solomon Islands reaches new agreement with China, and it comes with the following captions. The Solomon Islands is in discussions with China to allow military forces to be stationed in the Pacific Island, according to a leaked document. The opening line reads, a defense and security expert has warned Australia must intervene in an unacceptable potential military pact between the Solomon Islands and China. The draft security cooperation deal between Beijing and Honiara which enables greater Chinese involvement in the Pacific Islands region, was leaked online on Thursday night. The agreement would see increased Chinese aid to the Solomon Islands, which has a population of less than 1 million, and could see China establish a naval base on the island nation. The executive director at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings, said there was no doubt the leaked document was real, raising concerns of the implications to Australia's defences. The article is accompanied with an image with the following captions: Australian Defence Forces were deployed to the Solomon Islands to assist in peacekeeping efforts following deadly anti-government protests in Honiara in November 2021. Mr. Jennings said the security pact would give China pretty much carte blanche access to the Solomon Islands with its military. This is something unacceptable for an Australian strategic and defence point of view, Mr. Jennings told Sky News Australia's Pete Stefanovic. It would create a threat to the east of Australia and intelligence gathering opportunity for the Chinese. This is something we simply have to stop. Under the agreement, the Solomon Islands would be able to access armed police, military personnel, and other law enforcement from China to maintain social order on request. The article has an accompanying video entitled "Australia Should Have Left a Token Presence on Solomon Islands," according to former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. It's a video 1 minute and 43 seconds in duration, and then the article continues to read, however, China would be able to move military personnel and naval vessels onto the island according to its own needs. The article is accompanied with a picture, a photograph of Chinese President Xi Jinping with the Solomon Islands Prime Minister back in 2019. Further mentions of China relates to this paragraph over here. We should be thinking of a military presence ourselves in the Solomons rather than leaving that to the Chinese. Labour frontbencher Bill Shorten offered a more scathing assessment of the current government's handling of the situation in the Solomon Islands, calling it a major foreign policy blunder. The Morrison government has been asleep at the wheel, Mr. Shorten told the Nine Network on Friday. They keep polishing their defense credentials. I'm afraid this one's going to hang around for a very long time, and it's a mess. Based on this initial impression, a clear negative construction of China, do we see, and are we beginning to see an example of othering taking place? I think that much is clear. That's an affirmative. With that, we'll move along to the next article. Also published on the 25th of March, this headline reads, China Solomon Islands military deal, a wish list from Beijing. It's accompanied with a video 5 minutes and 30 seconds in duration, and the opening line reads, Lowy Institute Director of the Pacific Islands Program, Jonathan Pryke, says Australia must ensure its position as the provider of choice for security to the Solomon Islands. It comes as a leaked document reveals the Solomon Islands may allow Chinese military forces to be stationed on the Pacific Island, and Mr. Pryke said any draft agreement between China and the Solomon Islands still has a long way to go before any finalized agreement. In 2019, Solomon Islands swapped its diplomatic allegiance from Taiwan to China. We should be working our relationships between closed doors to see how far along this has gone. Based on this initial impression, I think China is represented in a somewhat to a negative light by way of this line over here. The deal with the Solomon Islands allowing Chinese military forces to be stationed on the Pacific Island, accentuating and amplifying the China threat theory by doing so. And with that, we'll move along to the next piece. Also published on March the 25th, This headline reads, Peter Dutton admits Solomon Islands' potential military arrangement with China has government very concerned. The subheader reads, the defense minister has admitted the potential military pact between China and the Solomon Islands is very concerning, especially with the close relationship between Russia and China. Written by Jack Mahoney on March 25, 2022 and published at 9 p.m. This article is accompanied with 45 comments, which we'll unpack at the end of the scan. The article is accompanied with a video 4 minutes and 44 seconds in duration, entitled Draft Agreement Between China and Solomon Islands Very Concerning, according to Peter Dutton. The opening line reads, Peter Dutton has admitted the military pact has him very concerned. The agreement between the two nations was leaked online in the form of a draft security cooperation deal that would enable greater Chinese involvement in the Indo-Pacific. Speaking to Sky News Australia host Peter Credlin, Mr. Dutton admitted the possibility of China establishing a naval base less than 2,000 kilometers from the Australian coast on the Solomon Islands had the government very concerned. We don't believe it's the best interest of the Indo-Pacific of peace and stability, but we want to see prevail over the course of the coming years and the coming decades to have a Chinese military presence of this nature within our region, he said. The article is accompanied with an image of the defense minister admitting the possibility was very concerning. This does cause significant concern, particularly when you see the very close relationship between Russia and China, and an extension of their power bloc into the Indo-Pacific is very concerning. The Australian government maintains a healthy relationship with the Solomon Islands after sending personnel to support during the last year's riots. There's still 50 people, including the AFP, Australian Federal Police, Australian Defence Force, members and people from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade who remain in the islands at their request. And moving along, the next article reads, a potential military pact could see the Chinese military establish a naval base, which would add to their really bulked up military presence in the Indo-Pacific region. Mr. Dutton said China already has 20 points of military presence in the South China Sea, hundreds of militia vessels which are supported by the People's Liberation Army in the East China Sea, building tensions with the Japanese Coast Guard, and were responsible for the death of Indian troops on their border. The defense minister called for Australia to be realistic about the growing presence of China in the Indo-Pacific region. There is really nothing that the Chinese have ruled out or that they're off the table, and if we think that this is just a problem with the Russians in the Ukraine and that this problem is limited to Europe, I just think we need to be realistic about the situation and what could prevail over the coming years. The likelihood of a conflict in our region in the Indo-Pacific is more and more real every day because of the outreach of China, because of their determination in relation to Taiwan. The article is further accompanied with a video 4 minutes and 23 seconds in length, entitled Bringing Military Tension to the South Pacific is in the interest of none of us. And this is from ASPI's Michael Shoebridge. The article continues to state, earlier in the day, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings, said the potential pact would give China pretty much carte blanche access to the Solomon Islands with its military. This is something unacceptable for an Australian strategic and defense point of view. Based on this initial impression of the article, I think it's fair to say that China is being painted as an other, and as you can see, there is a final video up here on the screen that accompanies the article, 11 minutes and 48 seconds in length, and it's given the title, Australia is a leader in the Pacific region despite the constant pressure coming to the area. The article continues to state, Labour frontbencher Bill Shorten often offered a more scathing assessment of the current government's handling of the situation in the Solomon Islands, calling it a major foreign policy blunder The Morrison government has been asleep at the wheel, according to Mr. Shorten. They keep polishing their defense credentials. I'm afraid this one's going to hang around for a long time, and it's a mess. Based on this impression, I think it's fair to say China is represented in a negative way, constructed as an other. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 26th of March at 6:02 a.m. is this next article, and it reads in its headline, "Universities must be more discerning concerning China." The opening line reads, Liberal Senator James Paterson says universities must be more discerning on partnerships between Australian universities and Chinese companies. It comes after a security report by the Federal Parliament provided recommendations to the Foreign Minister concerning the funding and academic autonomy of Confucius Institutes on Australian university campuses. It's important that universities control the curriculum and hiring and firing of staff, Mr. Patterson told Sky News Australia. It's important for university to reflect, do they really want to be party to a soft power exercise for a foreign authoritarian government which has engaged in systemic human rights abuses and has even been accused of genocide, a clear construction of China as an other, and also a clear construction of China as negative. Based on this initial impression, negative, that is a tick for this one. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. The headline reads, Extremely irresponsible, China hits back at Australia over Solomon Islands deal. It's accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 38 seconds in length. I'm sharing the same title as the headline. The opening line reads, China has hit back at Australia after concerns were raised over a potential military deal with the Solomon Islands. Prime Minister Scott Morrison insisted he wasn't blindsided by the move. The deal would see China dramatically increase its military presence in the Indo-Pacific region, with a potential base on the Solomon Islands for its defense forces, which would see warships stationed just 2,000 kilometers from Australia's coastline. After concerns were raised from politicians on both sides within Australia, the Solomon Islands government defended the move, whilst China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson labelled Australia as being irresponsible. We hope that parties concerned will look at it objectively and calmly and not over-interpret it. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said, some politicians on the Australian side have published some fallacies of so-called Chinese coercion and deliberately created an atmosphere of tension, which is extremely irresponsible and does not help regional stability and development. This article is a somewhat tricky one. At the onset, it looked like it was a negative representation of China, but the fact that they have given the Chinese Foreign Ministry a platform to retort suggests to me that this is not just a clear case of a negative construction. This will be something I have to reevaluate during the analysis stage, but for now, I think I'm going to go with somewhat negative. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. Its headline reads, Scott Morrison says there is great concern or cross-Pacific family over China's potential new military pact with the Solomon Islands. Published on March 26, 2022 at 3:10 p.m. The subheader reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said, Australia respects the sovereignty of individual Pacific Island states, but will work with partners to ensure there is a keen understanding of the risks and threats the draft security deal between the Solomon Islands and China possesses. The article is accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 38 seconds in duration, entitled Extremely Irresponsible, China Hits Back at Australia over Solomon Islands Deal. The opening paragraph reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison says there's great concern across the Pacific family in the wake of China's potential new military pact with the Solomon Islands. This article is written by Zoe Zerchak, deputy editor at Sky News Australia, and there are an accompanying 24 comments to this article. The following paragraph reads, the draft security cooperation deal between the two, which enables greater Chinese involvement in the Pacific Islands region, was leaked online on Tuesday night. The agreement will include increased Chinese aid sent to the Solomon Islands and could see China establish a naval base on the island about 2,000 kilometers northeast of Australia. Mr. Morrison was again asked about the leaked security deal during a press conference about an additional $52.3 million in funding for Lifeline Australia over 4 years. The article continues to state, I think there's great concern across the Pacific family because we are in constant contact with our Pacific family, Mr. Morrison said on Saturday. Moving along, the Prime Minister said Australia respects the sovereignty of individual island states in the region but remains on alert. They'll make their own decisions in their own places and we respect their democracies. At the same time, we'll work with our partner states in the Pacific to ensure there is a keen understanding of the risks and threats we believe this poses. The article is accompanied by another video, 7 minutes and 8 seconds in duration, and that's entitled Australia Cannot Ignore National Defence Ahead of Federal Budget. In the concluding paragraphs of this article, they read, Defence Minister admitted the possibility of China establishing a naval base about 2,000 kilometers from the Australian coast had the government very concerned. We don't believe it's in the best interest of the Indo-Pacific of peace and stability that we want to see prevail over the course of the coming years and the coming decades to have a Chinese military presence of this nature within our region, he told Sky News Australia host Peter Cretlin on Friday. This does cause significant concern because particularly when you see the very close relationship between Russia and China, an extension of their power bloc into the Indo-Pacific is very concerning. The video is accompanied by the article is accompanied by one more video, 4 minutes and 44 seconds in duration, entitled The Draft Concerned, very concerning to Peter Dutton. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. But before I do so, I think it's somewhat clear that this would make a negative construction or representation of China a clear act of othering, placing Russia and China as an extension of the power bloc, bringing that power projection into the Indo-Pacific that is of great concern to Australia. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 27th of March, this headline reads, PM Solomon's China Pact Bad for Region. It is accompanied by a video 1 minute and 54 seconds in duration. And its opening line reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison is calling the Solomon Islands proposed security pact with China a bad deal for the Indo-Pacific. However, Mr. Morrison says he will not pressure the island nation to dumping. So Sky News Australia reinforcing the message multiple times on March 26th and once more on March 27th, stressing that this pact is bad for the Indo-Pacific region. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that China is represented and constructed in a negative manner. Solomons is making no apologies, while Beijing has accused Australia of irresponsibly undermining stability in the region. A clear case of othering taking place. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. My apologies, that was the final article for the week from Sky News Australia relating to China. PM Solomon's China Pact bad for the region. This therefore concludes our look at Sky News Australia and Global Times for the week running from Monday 21st of March to Sunday the 27th of March. There were 16 mentions of Australia in the Global Times for the week, with articles ranging from Australia sets up Space Command against China, political show risks arms race, to articles such as exhibition of Indigenous art opens in National Gallery of Australia. In contrast, there were, interestingly enough as well, 23 mentions of China in Sky News Australia. This is the first time I've seen Sky News Australia having more articles than Global Times, dating back to easily December, November 2021. So this is a noteworthy moment. Thank you so much for staying tuned to the Australia-China Media Watch podcast. This has been episode 19. Please stay tuned and return for episode 20 as I continue to document the news representations from these two sources about the opposing countries. Thank you so much indeed, and this is the Australia-China Media Watch podcast, signing off for now. Thank you very much.